gave his name as Mr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to HBKU's College of Islamic Studies, CIS, and to our important panel discussion tonight, which promises to engage and question views on the concept of Islamophobia. My name is Ahmed Shaheen, and I'm the Dean of the college here at CIS, where we strive to play a critical role in brightening Islam's future and the way it's perceived globally. At the College of Islamic Studies, we aim to portray that as Muslims, our role is vast as global citizens. Our graduates learn to study Islam and to apply its principles to contemporary issues, such as environmental ethics, design thinking, urbanism, post-colonial studies, bioethics, and genomics. They learn to develop Islamic financial systems that adhere to the Sharia. They explore the rich history of Islamic art and architecture. They understand that Muslims have a critical role in advancing the world for the better in global matters. And each one learns something about themselves and how they can utilize the interests, skills, and the knowledge developed here at CIS to be of service to their communities and the world. Hamad bin Khalifa University is a research-intensive university, and our faculty, researchers, and students learn to embody this aspect. In light of the topic today, Islamophobia, I can provide a small glimpse in what we aim to achieve and what our students have done. Our faculty members are actively going to India, China, the Vatican, Benin, Bangladesh, and Central Asia to provide Islamic training and a more informed understanding of Islam and Islamic texts. One of our students advocates for gender equality in peacekeeping, in peacemaking, and conflict prevention at the United Nations as a UN Alliance for Civilizations fellow, while another student aims to highlight marginalized Muslim voices in her presentation at a conference in the Netherlands. We actively work with renowned institutions such as the University of Notre Dame to facilitate critical thinking and understanding amongst Islamic leaders and imams in Pakistan and India. Yet another professor is leading the Covenants of the Prophets project, which explores historical evidence of interfaith relations dating back to our Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is this and so much more that carries our mission forward. And yet, it's never enough. The Islamophobia phenomenon continues to mutate, escalate, and contaminate relations around the world. And we hope our panel discussion today will provide that insight behind this extremely challenging force. On that note, I'm extremely thankful to each and every one of our panelists tonight, who truly honor us by being here and sharing their perspectives. I would also like to thank and introduce our chair for the panel tonight, who we are also fortunate to have, Dr. Nader Hashmi. Dr. Nader Hashmi is an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics. It's the Skype, from the Skype. He's flipping pages. Dr. Nader Hashmi is an associate professor of Middle East and Islamic politics, as well as director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, University of Denver. He obtained his doctorate from the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and previously was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University and a visiting assistant professor at the UCLA Global Institute. He is the author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward the Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies, Oxford University Press, and co-editor of the People Reloaded, the Green Movement and the Struggle for Democracy in Iran, the Syrian Dilemma, and Sectarization Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. His views and thoughts are frequently sought across various international and regional channels and publications, including CNN International, Al Jazeera English, CTV News, PBS, The Globe and Mail, Newsweek, The New York Times, and many more. Please welcome Dr. Nader Hashmi.
I think the panel should join us now, and then we'll get started. So if we can have everyone up at the front. Okay, well, thank you very much, Imad Shaheen, for the invitation. Just a shout out to the wonderful work that you have been doing here at Hamad bin Khalifa University. I'm very happy to be back in Doha to make a contribution to the wonderful work that you've started here at this prestigious institution. Islamophobia has long been discussed as a uniquely Western problem. When you think about the topic, you think about discrimination against Muslims in France. You think about the situation in the United States today. You think about the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment in different parts of the world. But tonight we are going to be looking at the question of Islamophobia in a somewhat different perspective. Think about the following. The three largest countries by population in our world today, China, India, and the United States of America, are to varying degrees hostile toward Muslims. In each case, Muslims are now at the forefront of civil rights struggles. Their chances look, I think, most bleak and hopeless in China, where today there is a full-blown cultural genocide underway against the Uyghur Muslims, replete with mosque destruction, the creation of a massive surveillance state, and the incarceration of at least 1 million Uyghur Muslims in what Amnesty International has called the equivalent of wartime concentration camps. In India, the rise of Hindu nationalism under Narendra Modi has led to a wave of Muslim persecution, harassment, and discrimination against Indian Muslims. The crackdown in Kashmir continues unabated, and on December the 11th, the Indian Parliament passed an explicitly anti-Muslim citizenship law that rocked the country, drew international condemnation, and continues to destabilize Indian politics and society. Just before coming to this event, I was happy to learn that prominent Bollywood actors in India are now speaking out against this state of affairs. And finally, there is the country that I currently live in, the United States of America. Donald Trump was elected 3 years ago after campaigning on an explicitly anti-Muslim platform. Well-known Islamophobes staff important positions in the U.S. government, and one of the first things that Donald Trump did as President of the United States was to issue an executive order known as the Muslim travel ban. When that travel ban was announced in January of 2017, opinion polls in the United States suggested that roughly half of the country supported the ban, and just yesterday, the Muslim travel ban, it was announced, has been expanded to 6 more countries, most of those countries with substantial Muslim populations. And I'm also here to tell you, living in the United States, that Donald Trump stands a good chance of getting reelected again in November. So this problem is by no means going away. So it is against this backdrop that we have organized this panel called Global Islamophobia, Understanding Its Roots, Challenging Its Impact. Islamophobia has gone global, and this forces us to consider the problem of Islamophobia at the international level. How are these manifestations of Islamophobia that I've just described similar? How are they different? Why are they emerging at this particular moment in history? and not before? What common themes tie them together? And finally, how can Islamophobia be confronted and rolled back, both domestically, regionally, and internationally? These are the questions that shape this panel tonight. The format will be as follows. I've asked all of the panelists to prepare a 10-minute introductory statement. I want the panelists to know that I'm going to be enforcing that 10-minute time limit fairly strictly in the best tradition of Middle Eastern authoritarianism. I will ask them to start to wrap up at 10 minutes, and then there will be some discussion among the panelists. I will pose some questions, and then we will turn it over to the audience to take your questions and comments from the floor. Our panel consists of the following persons. The first speaker will be Professor John Esposito, who unfortunately couldn't be with us physically, but he will be joining us in a moment via Skype. John Esposito is University Professor of Religion and International Affairs, and Professor of Islamic Studies at Georgetown University. He's the founding director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and the important Bridge Initiative, Protecting Pluralism and Ending Islamophobia at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He's the past president of the American Academy of Religion and the Middle East Studies Association. He's the author of more than 55 books, and I should mention that John was one of the very first people to very first scholars to write about Islamophobia in his very important book, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, that came out in the early 1990s. Karen Armstrong is a public intellectual, author, scholar, who's widely viewed around the world as a leading authority on comparative religion. She's an international bestseller, author of such books such as A History of God, The Battle for God, Fields of Blood, Islam: A Short History, and not one, but two biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. And her most recent book is The Lost Art of Scripture, Rescuing the Sacred Texts. Her books have been translated into 45 languages, and she is the recipient of numerous awards and prizes for her contribution on intercultural relations. Asifa Qureshi Landes is professor of law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and specializes in comparative Islamic and U.S. constitutional law. She is a Carnegie Scholar in 2009, a 2012 recipient of a Guggenheim Fellow. She's served as a public delegate on the United Nations delegation to the UN Commission on the Status of Women and has served as an advisor to the Pew Task Force on Religion and Public Life. She's currently working on a book manuscript, Islamic Reconstitutionalism, in which she proposes a new model of Islamic constitutionalism for today's Muslim-majority societies. And last, but certainly not least, is Professor Azmayordi Azra. He's professor of history and culture at Saif Hidayatullah State University in Jakarta, where he is the former rector and graduate school director. He's widely known as being one of the most prestigious and influential Indonesian scholars and public intellectuals and distinguished voices on matters related to Indonesia and Southeast Asian politics. He's been an advisor to the Indonesian vice president, author of 36 books, the recipient of numerous awards that reflects his scholarly contributions, and we're very happy to have him as part of this panel as well. So with that as an introduction, I hope the connection to the United States is clear, and I'll turn the floor over to my good friend John Esposito, who will speak to us for roughly the next 10 minutes.
Good evening. I regret that I cannot be with you today, but I look forward to next year. We have a very important topic, and I have 10 minutes to cover it, so excuse me if I'm a bit fast. Islamophobia has become normalized, globalized, and mainstream part of our domestic politics, media coverage, and global affairs. It has grown and spread globally from North America, the US and Canada, to Europe, China, Myanmar, or Australia. It exists in countries where there are no significant numbers of Muslims, like Hungary and Poland, and yet it is a social cancer even there. And of course, it impacts the issue of immigration across Europe and certainly in the United States, regrettably. What do I mean by Islamophobia? Islamophobia is an extreme or exaggerated fear of and hostility towards Islam and Muslims. So here, I'm not talking about being afraid of militant Muslim groups, but we're talking about Islam and Muslims in general. It often leads to social and political discrimination, hate speech, and hate crimes, and can be used to rationalize policies such as mass surveillance, incarceration, disenfranchising groups, and military attacks and invasions of countries. Because of the limited time that I have, I'm going to focus on the US, but I'll also make some comments about Europe itself. When we talk about the encounter of Islam in America, let me say very briefly that when I got into the field in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the response of almost everybody was, "You'll never have a job." Islam was invisible in America. Yes, there were Muslims, but they were known as Egyptians, Lebanese, etc. But in fact, America was seen as a country of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. However, Iran became the lens through which both the US and Europe viewed Islam and Muslims. For the Americans, the sense of America held hostage, fear of export of Iran's Islamic revolution. The Ayatollah Khomeini called for its export, and we saw uprisings in various parts of the Gulf, but he was talking even more globally. So that by the 1990s, the attitude towards Islam put out there by many was that Islam was a historic, civilizational, and demographic threat to the West. Historical, civilizational, and demographic, that is population growth, to the West. And that continues today. Let me just read one brief thing to you from a very prominent Palestinian American, Edward Said. For those of you that don't know Edward or didn't know Edward, he was extraordinarily prominent and incisive in his understanding of the world. In 1981, I want to emphasize this, in 1981, he said, "For the general public in America and Europe today, Islam is news of a particularly unpleasant sort. The media, the government, geopolitical strategists, all in concert, see Islam or present it as a threat to Western civilization." What I am saying, Edward Said said, what I am saying is that negative images of Islam are very much more prevalent than any others, and that such images correspond not with what Islam is, but to what prominent sectors of a particular society take it to be. Edward was ahead of his time. For it was 10 years later that we then wind up seeing in that period, Islam being seen as a triple threat. It was that concern that led me in the early 1990s to write a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. However, by the late 1990s, I had to put a whole new section in there on Islamophobia. It was only years later in 2010 that Islamophobia came to be seen, and in America, the word used and the phenomenon understood. So we have a real gap here in terms of real understanding of who Muslims are, what's going on in the Muslim world. This sense of a threat was fed by the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Indeed, the day that I was signing to write my book, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, by coincidence, I had an appointment with the United States Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. And at one point in the conversation, he said to me, there were issues going on in Algeria. Will Algeria be another Iran? And I remember saying to him, no, for a variety of reasons, but we need to be careful not seeing Islam as militant and a militant global threat. And on the one hand, he agreed with me, but on the other hand, he said, well, with the fall of the Soviet Union, we see an international ideology and enemy gone, and the concern can be what ideology is that strong out there, referring to Islam and Muslims. And you'll see a bit later when I refer to the Trump administration, very often a number of members of the Trump administration actually will say that Islam is really not a religion, it's a political ideology and a dangerous political ideology. In 1993, Hasib Sabag and a group of Christian and Muslim, Arab Christian and Muslim businessmen from the Gulf created a center at Georgetown, provided the funding for it, called the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And I moved to Georgetown to become its first director. We had a wonderful time with our program, spreading our message, et cetera, from 93 on. But when 2001, when 9/11 came, everything changed dramatically. The chair of our committee, our advisory committee, said, "You've done a wonderful job, but this will put us back 20 years. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Well, many years have gone by, and I think it'll be many years before we actually can deal with it. The situation of seeing Islam as not just a potential threat, but global threat, was intensified enormously with the rise of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, and a sense that, and a message that indeed one was talking about a global jihad. In other words, they weren't talking about simply that there would be problems within individual countries, as had already occurred and was occurring in countries like Egypt, Syria, Algeria, etc., with militant movements, but rather that there was a global dimension to it. In 2010, the Mosque at Ground Zero issue arose in America. And it was in 2010 for the first time that a major publication, Time magazine, used the word Islamophobia. The title was, "Is America Islamophobic? Does America have a problem, with Islamophobia?" And the message in it was clearly yes. But what it showed also was that you could have people, not only in New York, where the mosque was being built, from all over the country, coming to oppose the mosque that had been approved by officials at the local level and at the state level. And you had major demonstrations, and then you saw a ripple effect where across America we had problems with mosques getting permission to be built, attacks on mosques, and also where we had then this tsunami wave of anti-Sharia rhetoric that occurred. That is, having people, not only members of anti-Muslim groups, but having major politicians, like the Speaker of the House of Representatives, saying that there was a danger of Sharia being implemented in the United States. The impact at that time across America was significant. It increased the growth of these kinds of groups. Now, very briefly, let me talk about instances that have supported this approach and misunderstanding of Islam. Clearly, when it comes to Islamophobia, the media and presidential elections are important. Of course, it also includes domestic and international terrorist attacks of Al-Qaeda and ISIL. But mass and social media and American presidential elections, and especially today, the Trump administration, have been major catalysts for the growth of Islamophobia. Failure to distinguish between Islam and the vast majority of Muslims and the barbaric actions of militant extremists has come to be accepted by many. The Public Religion Research Institute commented, "No religious, social, or racial or ethnic group was perceived as facing greater discrimination in the U.S. than Muslims." This, in turn, had a significant impact on the U.S. and European domestic and foreign policies. It threatens Muslim civil liberties, influences the radicalization of some Muslims, and also winds up generating non-Muslim extremist groups. For example, in America, we have these white nationalist groups, and you have them also in the UK and in Europe, who are anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, anti-any non-white member of our population. That attitude has also fostered and legitimated the invasion and occupation of Muslim countries. It influenced the U.S. and the EU responses to the Arab Spring, an ambivalent approach when it saw people within the region coming to power and governments of dictators disappearing, and then the willingness, when Sisi took power, to eventually become what is now a standard ally in the U.S., and to foster what then became an Arab Spring that became an Arab Winter. And we see today that the U.S. and EU have gone back to their support authoritarian regimes, seeing them as allies. And what about the media? And again, I'll have to be very brief here. If we look at two major studies, because it's important that you see that I'm not just saying this, but there's quantitative proof. From 2000 to 2011, Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R, you can get this information on the internet, looked at 975,000 news stories from the US and European media, which demonstrated the shocking disparity of coverage. Networks significantly reduced coverage to action of, significantly increased coverage of these actions of militants. In 2001, when you look at all of that media out there, 2% of all the news stories in Western media presented images of Muslim militants. On the other hand, only 0.1% showed stories of ordinary Muslims, of the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. When we look at the period later, that is 2015 to 2016, we see it becoming completely normalized. An all-time highest level of negative coverage. TV coverage in one study showed that over 80% of media coverage on Islam is negative. In the US, UK, and Germany, 9 out of 10 newspaper articles were negative. This, in turn, is fed by what we see, for example, in the United States, a major amount of money supporting these Islamophobic writers and websites. One study by the Center for American Progress found that some $42.5 million flowed from 7 foundations over a 10-year period. This information is based on income tax returns, which are public information. That's how you can be sure the accuracy. CARE, the Council for American and Islamic Relations, did a study that looked at 2008 to 2013 and $205,838,000. I'll say that again. $205 million went to these people who are purveyors, have anti-Muslim websites or websites that put out, among other things, anti-Muslim messages, and to organizations and groups and elections. The 2008 and 2012 elections of Obama. Think about the accusation that Obama was not born an American. It was Mr. Trump that brought this and supported it so long. Think about the fact that President Obama, although he went to mosques overseas in Egypt and Indonesia, waited until the last year of his 8-year term to go to a mosque in America because of the concern of a kind of political blowback. But now let's look at the Trump administration itself. CNN's Anderson Cooper, during the election in 2016, asked President Trump if he thought Islam is at war with the West. President Trump responded, Islam hates us. He didn't say a lot of Muslims hate us, a few Muslims hate us. Islam hates us. There's a tremendous hatred there. There is an unbelievable hatred to us. He advocated a temporary freeze on all foreign Muslim immigration, monitoring, or even the forced closure of American mosques. Now, finally, let's look at the administration that came in with the president. His former counselor and chief strategist, Steve Bannon, was a prominent and is a prominent voice, saying that it's not just that there's a clash of civilizations, it's a clash between Islam and Christianity. And he foresees and even would like to see this clash actually fought so that it could be cleared up and that, as it were, the enemy could be marginalized. If we look at the current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, former head of the CIA, in 2013, 2 months after the Boston Marathon bombing, Pompeo delivered remarks in the House of Representatives stating, quote, silence condemning these acts has made the Islamic leaders across America potentially complicit. The fact is, American Muslim leaders have denounced major attacks consistently, and that information is available on the internet, but it's not available most of the time and covered in major media. Attacks are, but not really the extent to which American Muslims are not representative there, and with American religious leaders have spoken out against it. Mr. Pompeo received an award. He's been associated with and then received an award when he became Secretary of State from Act for America, his highest honor, called the Security Eagle Award in 2016. Act for America is listed as an anti-Muslim hate group. So you can see that kind of influence. Jeff Sessions, who was the Attorney General after Trump was elected, warned that, quote, totalitarian threat to the free world from ideological and apocalyptic Islam. Sessions supported the Muslim ban. And the language used for the Muslim ban, the subtitle is Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. As we know, the basic countries that were listed in that ban, none of them had provided, as it were, terrorists that had come to America. As a result of this kind of approach, what have we seen? A staggering 84% decrease in immigrant visas issued to nationals from the 5 countries listed above. 84% decrease. Families have been torn apart as some parents have never met their children. Other individuals have had to postpone their wedding, and some have died waiting. Additionally, between 2016 and 2018, of all refugees settled in the U.S., there was a drastic 91% decrease of Muslims. What needs to be done? Here I'll be very brief because there is no time for that, and there are other speakers here. Let me just say to you that if you're thinking about how significant is this issue and what needs to be done, how important is it, you can go to the bridge, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia, which is a project that we have at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. Go to bridge.georgetown.edu. I'll say it again, bridge.georgetown.edu. You will find all kinds of information about what's going on across the whole world, what has gone, and what's going on today, and what are issues. But very importantly, go to a section called Fact Sheets. Fact Sheets. And there you will see we have the fact sheet on major players who support Islamophobia, whether they're in the media or in politics. You will see, for example, the major members of the current administration in America, but also major political leaders across Europe, etc. We all live in countries and in a world where religious and political pluralism, democracy, and civil liberties are threatened. They are shrinking. Governments, but not only governments, all of us are challenged to respond as citizens, as members of the media, political leaders, and religious leaders. Thank you.
Okay, John, thank you for being with us. The connection is not 100%, so we'll let you go. We really appreciate you taking the time to share with us those comments. And I'm going to turn the floor over now to our next speaker, Karen Armstrong. Karen, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this working? Okay, good. I'm going to go back a bit further than John for the roots of Islamophobia, way back to medieval Europe. And I want to look very much at the psychology of what promotes this kind of group hatred. How did I get into this? It was at the time of the Salman Rushdie crisis, 1979, when you'll remember that Rushdie was stigmatized by the Iranian government and given the death sentence for his portrait of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, I did not like that fatwa, but I was appalled by the way the great and the good in Britain, philosophers, poets, novelists, came out in press to say that Islam was an evil religion. And I thought to myself, I was born in the last year of World War II, when we realized what could happen when this kind of hatred got out of hand, when we discovered the concentration camps. And I said to myself that we cannot permit this, we cannot permit any shred of this back in Europe. And indeed, by the end of that decade, there were concentration camps again on the outskirts of Europe, this time with Muslims in them in Bosnia. And the roots of this go right back to the time of the Crusades, the time when Europe was a very, very primitive society, just beginning to make its re-entry into the pre-modern world after the many years that followed of anarchy and primitivism that descended after the collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe. At the beginning, they were told they were going to rescue the tomb of Christ from the infidel, but they knew very little about Muslims. Not at all. The early 11th century poems show really Muslims are rather just like one of us. In Spain, they're our enemies, but they're like one of us. This changed. But the first people the Crusaders attacked were not Muslims, but Jews. These were the first pogroms that occurred in Europe, when it seemed insane to the Crusaders that they were going to march all this way, thousands of miles to Jerusalem, when the people who they thought, mistakenly, had killed Jesus were alive and well on their very doorsteps. And after that, crusading against Islam, there were many of these dreadful crusades, were linked always with anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness at home. Very often, if people couldn't go on a crusade, they would do their bit by killing Jews in Europe. And so it goes right back there. Now, at first, the Muslims figured very little in the imagination of Europeans. But as the crusading spirit went on, what happened was that they created an image of Islam that was the direct opposite of what Christians should be doing. There must have been a sort of buried guilt, really. They were fighting for Jesus, but Jesus had told them to love their enemies and turn the other cheek, not to kill them and exterminate them in droves, as the Crusaders did. And so what they did was they said Islam is a violent religion. They projected that buried worry about their own behavior onto the enemy that they were creating. Similarly, the thing about women, it was at this time in the Middle Ages that the popes were trying to impose celibacy on the extremely reluctant clergy. And so people on the Pope's side, writers and priests, said, well, look at the prophet with all his wives, and he was seen as some kind of sexual pervert. Again, another projection of things, buried worries at home, projected onto the enemy. And you have to understand that Islam in those days was like the United States today, a major, major world power, threatening, and everywhere in the world that you looked, there were Muslims. And so these things are linked. And so, you can, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and that's anti-Semitism has surfaced today in Britain. The last parliamentary election was lost by the Labour Party because of accusations that were, I'm afraid, very well founded of anti-Semitism in the leadership of the Labour Party. That is ingrained, it is there, it is part of the Western European psyche, I'm ashamed to say. But sometimes there can be a sort of an attraction and a sense of identification which can overcome these things. And I'm thinking of the United States today and Israel. Israel and the United States feel similar. they were both countries that were formed as a result of religious persecution in Europe, both of them in different ways, in different centuries. Both have the same problem with the people who were there before. The Palestinian people who were there before, whom the Zionists find difficult, as we know, to accept, and the Americans have the problem of the Native Americans, with whom they've never dealt really adequately. They might do a much better job in Canada, I believe. You know, when you speak in Canada, there's always somebody from the First Nation on the panel who speaks first, as a reminder, which we don't see in the United States. There is that sort of buried guilt, buried unease, and therefore a buried sense of identification against Israel, which, of course, projects onto Palestinians and Islam. And then, my last point, because I know we've got to be brief on this, is the nation state, the 19th century creation of the nation state. Before modern media occurred, it was impossible really to form a really national spirit. Why should people up in Scotland feel any identification with people right down in the south of England, of whom they knew nothing, had very few communications? But with the modern press, modern media, you can start building on this. And the nation state was very important in enhancing industrialization and getting the whole nation sort of geared to industry and enterprise. But very, very early in this process, Lord Acton, a British historian of the late 19th century, said that the nation state had two terrible flaws, a terrible flaw, that its emphasis on ethnicity, culture, and language would make it very, very difficult for people who did not fit the national profile. He said in some cases, with chilling accuracy, they could be enslaved or even exterminated. And it was not long after that, just a few decades after that, you had the massacre of the Armenians by the Young Turks, who were anxious to create a purely Turkic state. You had the Nazi Holocaust. And finally, you had the Bosnia massacres, fired by a really distressing and hideous amalgam of Serbian nationalism mixed with a perverted form of Serbian Christianity that created those horrors and those persecutions. So these things run deep. And I look at my country today, Brexit. As I was leaving to come here, we were leaving the European Union. After years of fighting one another for the nations, wretched nation states, slaughtering one another, not only in the two major world wars, but in many wars that had preceded for 200 years before that, we're now going back to the nation state. And the cry, which brings tears of horror to my eyes, is, let's make Britain great again. I always say, for God's sake, no, we did enough harm when we were great last time. Let's repeat the thing. Here's just two shocking indications. In the 2 weeks that followed the Brexit referendum 2 or 3 years ago, there was hate crimes in London increased by 68%. And at that time, I was still a trustee of the British Museum. And people were coming into the British Museum, visitors just coming in to see the exhibits, started yelling at members of the museum staff who were clearly not Caucasian and telling them that they had to go home. These are not just political niceties. These are deep in the psyche. They started way back with a really perverted form of Christianity at the time of the Crusades, a perverted hatred of Muslims because of their power, in many of the ways that people hate America today because of its power and ubiquity. And finally, the nation state, which is fueling stupidity like Brexit and other right-wing happenings in Europe. These are deeply psychological and can't be just smoothed out by nice legislation. We need to look deeply into our hearts and souls, see what's happened in the past, and see how we can prevent this from happening in the future. Thank you.
Asifa?
I need my... I come with audiovisual gifts. So hopefully it will work, inshallah. All right, yes, there it is. Yeah, all right. So I'm going to talk specifically about U.S. law and the way that Islamophobia manifests in the United States because that's my expertise. I'm a lawyer in the United States. I'm involved with, I teach constitutional law. I also work with Muslim lawyers on a regular basis. So we've been watching this as a legal issue, and I would like to say, when I look at it, it kind of wraps up with everything that Karen Armstrong just said about the ethnicity and then the sort of centralized xenophobia that comes with who you are as in your language and religion and culture, mixed with a sheen of legitimacy in the name of protecting public safety. So if you mix those two things together, you can have quite a lot of damage that legitimates bias and bigotry in the name of something that seems quite reasonable. And that's basically how Islamophobia manifests in the law in the United States, which then is borrowed, I think, around the world in various ways. So we already mentioned the Muslim ban. This is a depiction of what happened. So in 2017, there was a ban showing those 6-7 countries, which was litigated as this is unconstitutional, this is targeting Muslims, this is animus, this is malice towards Muslims. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And on a very dark day in June in 2018, the Supreme Court upheld the ban as perfectly constitutional, again, on the argument that, well, whatever may have been other arguments that might have been malicious or hate-based, that's not necessarily the only reason the government had instituted this. The U.S. government was able to convince the Supreme Court that there were legitimate national security reasons that justified the ban, and therefore it was upheld. And as you just heard, just this week, 6 more countries have been added to this ban. Just specifically, how does this impact people? This is any general immigration kind of visa is not given. You can still come in on student visas and other kind of business-related visas. However, there's been quite a lot of evidence that even on those visas, especially Iranians lately with the heightened tension with Iran, that students coming in on a student visa, valid student visa, are still being deported, even against a restraining order from a judge recently in Boston. So even the ones that look like they were still allowed in are still getting harassed and treated quite badly. Again, on the argument that, well, national security. And I want to say that this is actually an old practice. And a lot of things have happened in the United States that are both racially biased, bigoted, in the specific field of immigration particularly, and they've been justified on national security reasons. So I can go all the way back. She went all the way back to the Crusades. I'm not going to go quite that far back, but as far back as 1790, which lasted into the 20th century, Congress passed a law that said that you cannot become naturalized as a U.S. citizen unless you are white. And so you had lots of litigation over what is white, and you had all kinds of races trying to argue they were white in order to become citizens. There was a very famous Exclusion Act in the 1880s, late 1880s, specifically excluding all Chinese from coming into the country, and it was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So many people are seeing parallels with that. And then, of course, not immigration ban, but direct targeting of an entire race of people on the argument that they themselves, because of their race, were a threat to the United States, is famously the Japanese internment. And there's a picture there of the actual executive order that's posted on the streets of San Francisco, saying all of you of Japanese ancestry have to report to these internment camps. And this was litigated. Famously, Korematsu challenged this as this is a racial discrimination. We have a 14th Amendment clause that bans racial discrimination, other kinds of targeted discrimination, and not going into a lot of constitutional law, but basically the court says, as in other areas, you can meet the compelling state interest that would justify racial discrimination if it is in the name of national security. And so ironically, in the Trump versus Hawaii case, which actually upheld the Muslim ban, they cite the Korematsu case for the first time in a negative way, but they didn't actually overrule it. They just said that was a bad case, but it's actually never been overruled. So still you have lawyers tell their students every year, well, Korematsu is still good law. If it is in the name of national security, race discrimination can be justified, or at least constitutional. So that's the immigration side of things, and then sort of targeting as sort of fighting, potential war. And a lot of this has been heightened since 9/11 with the counterterrorism fears, but much of this was going on in small ways beforehand, targeting lots of racial groups, including Muslims. So then you see the heightening after 9/11 of specific counterterrorism efforts where lots of money and law enforcement effort and focus gets directed at the potential threat of Muslims as again, national security threat in particular. And again, predating Trump, it's gotten worse with Trump, but predating Trump, there were the countering violent extremism funds and resources put to Muslims that led to all kinds of surveillance and other kinds of trying to figure out what's going on with the Muslims. I tried to put a bunch of things together, and then I found this video that actually tells it much better than I can. So I'm going to spend a minute or so just playing this video, which was made by a Michigan Muslim woman filmmaker, that she was just interested in what's going on with everyone watching us all the time. And so she made this small, very award-winning film called The Feeling of Being Watched. So I'm just going to play that for a second. Oops, there we go.
And he gave his name as Mr. Rose. He said that I'm an FBI agent.
I start seeing him get all cars with no plate number.
We don't think that there's something wrong.
That damn car is always just parked right there.
It's like how you see in the movies, like those pizza vans that are just sitting staked out in front of your house. When you pass the van by, like they pull up a book or a magazine, like we can see you.
There it is. Ridgeview mosque leaders have been under surveillance for years.
Since August of 1999, I've been working to legally expose the very real and foreseeable Middle Eastern terrorist threats to American citizens at home and abroad. The successful investigation, which was codenamed Vulgar Betrayal, V-U-L-G-A-R, Betrayal,
I want to find out everywhere that our name is on a list.
I'm suing the FBI for information about surveillance, and I need as many people as possible to sign privacy waivers, so if the FBI has a file on them, they will release it.
Please, امشي. خلاص كفاية.
So that gives you a sense of what's going on. So there's lots of resources and money and effort directed at surveillance, covert actors acting within mosques, trying to gather information, reporting, and leading to all kinds of made-up charges that sometimes are won, sometimes are dropped, but it is definitely a sense of being watched by lots of Muslims in the United States. This, despite the fact that even before the Trump administration's white supremacist rhetoric, the FBI has repeatedly said that the greatest physical threat, harm, terrorist threat in the United States is repeatedly documented as white supremacist groups. And this is only heightened post the Trump administration's rhetoric, which tends to encourage that kind of white hate speech by white supremacists. Now, you might be wondering, aren't there hate crimes legislation in the United States? There is. There is hate crimes legislation. If a violent act is done motivated by some kind of hate, you can prosecute someone in a different way and with different consequences than just any other physical violent act. However, it, as you can imagine, is quite difficult to prove motive, right? It's very difficult to prove that it is actually motivated by that kind of hate. So the picture on the right there is, you may remember a very, very tragic case of two students and one sister of the students in University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which by all I would say objective accounts indicated that this person who had brutally executed, like execution style, behind the head shooting, kneeling on the ground, with all kinds of anti-Islamic rhetoric that had been directed at them for months and months and months. He was prosecuted, they caught him, he was given 2 life sentences, but it was not charged as a hate crime. So this is the heightening of white supremacy causing hate crimes against Muslims is happening simultaneous with those being very difficult to prove as hate crimes, simultaneous with additional surveillance and looking at Muslims as the threat is this great irony of what's going on. So in addition to surveilling us, they're surveilling our money. So one of the things that the government has done is, well, we don't want to be complicit, or any of our banks complicit in any kind of funding of money to terrorist organizations. So there's many, many various regulations directed at banks and other financial institutions to restrict a kind of transfer of money. And if you've tried to transfer money back and forth into the United States, you kind of experience a lot heightened scrutiny of wire transfers and this kind of thing. But it also manifests in these very interesting kind of odd stories that have been going on for years, and that is like random closing of Muslim bank accounts in Muslim names, including just this past October, an organization I've been involved with, which is the National Association of Muslim Lawyers. Just weeks before our annual conference, they just closed our bank account down. This is Muslim lawyers. They're willing to close our bank account down without any fear that we're going to do much that can stop it. And in fact, it is very difficult, our civil litigation lawyers said, to try to find any kind of grounds for that, because banks are told to have their own monitoring of kind of regulatory oversight, and they're given lots of discretion. So even to the point where Venmo, this is just from last week, this woman paid back her friend from having breakfast at a Chicago restaurant, and in her the tagline you say on Venmo to say what the payment was for, she said Amin, Amin, in English, written out A-M-E-E-N, because she was saying Amin to the wonderful breakfast we just had. Venmo flagged that payment and demanded an explanation of what the payment was for before they would transfer that money. They eventually unfroze the payment, but still that's the example of the kind of hyper scrutiny that Muslims are getting both personally and with our money. John Esposito mentioned mosque expansion. Another thing that's happening is there's incredible use of what seem like neutral laws and are neutral laws, like zoning, sound ordinances, parking regulations, but they're being harnessed to stop mosque expansion or even mosque building in communities. So the ability for Muslims to coordinate their own community events is being affected by using what, again, look like quite neutral laws. And as he also mentioned, the first big case of this that was litigated was this Murfreesboro, Tennessee mosque, in the middle of the United States. In the litigation, they actually fought these kinds of trying to stop their mosque from being built. In the litigation, the lawyer trying to stop the mosque actually said, Islam is not a religion, it is a political movement. And what is being taught in these mosques is violence and attempts to take over the United States. That went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and alhamdulillah, the Muslims won that case, but it is a constant fight to try to continuously allow the kind of natural community expansion to happen in the face of this kind of oversight. And then lastly, I wanted to point to what was also mentioned is the anti-Sharia legislation movement, which also predates the Trump administration. It looks to me like it started right about the time of President Obama being elected and causing lots of sort of fear of what does this mean in the, again, white majority community. And so you saw a rise of legislation passed in many, many states. This one report says since 2010, 201 bills have been introduced in 43 states. So that's a lot of attention on this idea. What's going on with this? I could go on and on because I've written about it, but the basic, in a nutshell, is the idea that, well, one of the ways that Muslims will attack and take over the United States is not physical jihad violence, but actually it could be like a Trojan horse inside of the United States. We'll transform the law so that it will be Sharia instead of US law, and so we need to be hyper vigilant to stop that from happening. So they pass these laws that say US judges may not reference any other foreign law when they're giving their decisions. At first, it was actually specifically written, it can't reference Sharia law. That was actually litigated, and the Muslims won that litigation, saying you can't target a particular religion in any one litigation and any one legislation. So they changed it to foreign law, and if you're interested, you can go to that American Laws for American Courts website. That is basically the boilerplate language they use that they just cut and paste, and then they send it around to different states to try to pass this law. Just in a nutshell, my first reaction when this was coming up was I hated it. I thought it was biased and bigoted and Islamophobic, but I didn't think it would have much of an impact on actual cases, because I'd been watching these cases where Islamic law does come up in litigation, and it's mostly family law cases where often women are in a divorce case, women are bringing up their kitab, their marriage contract, which has a mahr listed, and they are bringing it up as this was an agreement my husband agreed to give me upon divorce, and so they're bringing it up as part of the settlement of assets in the divorce case. So I'd read these cases, and I knew that if there was anything kind of odd about public policy in these contracts, the judges just said, I'm sorry, I can't honor that. So it didn't seem to me it would have much of an impact, because basically they already were only honoring things that were already consistent with American due process and public policy. But I was wrong. There is this case in Kansas where, citing the anti-Sharia bill, not in Kansas, but in the next door state, but anyway, the judge denied this one woman her mahr to the tune of $650,000 US. Ironically, a lot of the language in the opinion was crazy, protecting, saving women kind of language, that's why they're not enforcing Sharia. But I don't think that the woman in this case thought that she was being quite very protected when she lost $650,000 US. But anyway, they're having a real impact. So I want to wrap up here, though, with what is going on, what is the impact on this? And I've noticed one thing. I mentioned the surveillance, and you saw the movie The Surveillance. One thing that I noticed is that the impact on immigrant Muslims in the United States and children of immigrant Muslims experiencing this kind of surveillance from the US government was shocking, and they were angry, and they made movies like this. But the response that I observed from the African American Muslim community in the United States was, oh, really? You don't like that, do you? Huh? Because that's been happening to us basically since the beginning of the United States, because there is racial treatment of our criminal justice system. It is racialized all the way down to the bottom. And so we've already been profiling people on racial basis for a very long time, most predominantly the African American community, in which we have many brothers and sisters in Islam. So what happened was, to me, this is a wake-up call for Muslims to pay attention to all of the other kind of racial and bigoted kind of treatment that's institutionalized in our system. And I hope that that is what ends up happening, that we end up having natural allies in this fight that's not just about Islamophobia, but it's about bigotry in general and harnessing the power of the state and of law to hurt people ostensibly for neutral security reasons, but really it's about bigotry. And this is one of my favorite pictures from, again, the Muslim ban. The first one, droves of people showed up at airports because they were so angry with what was happening, of all types. And this wonderful picture of this Jewish man with his son with a kippah next to a Muslim man with his daughter wearing hijab, both together fighting this injustice. And so that's what I want to say, is that what do we do about this? John Esposito asked what can be done, and I'm sure this will be part of our conversation. One of the things that I think you can do, and Muslims can do and should do, is to see that if we stand up against injustice, not just when it affects Muslims, but especially when it doesn't affect Muslims, when it affects other people, then Muslims will be known for justice rather than the false information they're seeing on their news feed, right? We don't have a pope to explain to the world that terrorism is bad and un-Islamic and against God's will. So the pope can't speak for us. Islamic values have to speak for Islam. We have to be those values in the real world, showing them that whatever they heard on the news about Muslims is not true. So that's what I think is the true antidote. You do need to have Muslims out there in the world standing with all of those natural allies who are also experiencing injustice. So you see people are doing this. You have pictures of this woman at the top is a Muslim woman doctor in Flint, Michigan, who noticed the incredible water crisis that was happening with the poisoning of our water of our children. When a Jewish cemetery was vandalized in Pittsburgh, this Muslim group targeted, I don't know if you can see that, but they targeted $20,000 to raise funds from the Muslim community to give to the Jewish community to repair their synagogue. They raised $162,000 instead of the $20,000 goal. And at the bottom, you can see Muslims standing in solidarity at the Mexican-American border, where children are being separated from their families as part of our horrific detention and deportation policies about refugees trying to come into the United States from Latin America. When you see Muslims standing for those causes too, that's when I think that we will have a real shift in the kind of cancer of Islamophobia that we just said. That, and we need good lawyers.
Thank you, Asifa. Professor Azra, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether it is quite relevant to talk about Islamophobia in Indonesia. As you might know, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, our country with the largest Muslim population. Almost 90% of Indonesia's 268 million people is Muslim, so almost 90%. And of course, the situation of Indonesia is quite different from, let's say, any other Muslim country. Even though Indonesia is very big, it is the largest maritime continent, if you will. Remember also, in addition to being the largest Muslim country, Indonesia is also the third largest democracy after India and USA, and the fourth most populated country in the world after China, India, USA, and Indonesia. So I don't know whether in Indonesia there should be also Islamophobia, because for many reasons, for some reason. I think the first one, Indonesia is not dependent on any. This is, I think, the first very important factor, that Indonesia is not dependent on economy or security on US, on America, or any other European country. In the last 20 or 30 years, Indonesian economy developed, quite steadily, 5% annual growth of Indonesian economy. So now you have, I think, you can find the largest Muslim middle class in Indonesia also. More than 150 million. So that's why Indonesia sent the largest number of Muslim Hajj pilgrims to Mecca every year, and also the largest, I think, 1.5 million Umrah pilgrim, lesser pilgrimage every year. And then we have to wait between 15 to 25 years in order to get admitted to go for pilgrimage, because pilgrimage in Indonesia is managed by Ministry of Religious Affairs. You cannot go by yourself. Yeah. So this is the situation. So we are not dependent on US aid, US military. Or we don't have any military station in Indonesia. So that's what, this is one of the problem, one of the advantage of Indonesia. So of course there is a lot of suspicions, hostility among Muslims, including also Indonesia, that, for instance, the predicament in the Middle East is also created by foreign powers. The continued political contestation, conflict, civil wars in this part of the world, in this part of the Muslim world, is also a result of the interference of foreign powers. Of course, America, US, and also European powers for many, many years. I think Karen knows about it for many years. Secondly, I think the most important factor is the fact that Indonesian Muslim in general practice what you can call as wasatiyah Islam, middle fast Islam, ummatan wasatan, according to Quranic terms. We are in Indonesia has long been considered as a not really Muslim, not real Muslim. Because why? Because we adopt a lot of socio-cultural, local, indigenous socio-cultural practices. We are different from, let's say, the practice of Wahhabi that put a lot of emphasis on the pure and pristine Islam. Rather, we love to practice ziyarah, for instance. We love to practice various kind of, many kinds of walima, celebration. If somebody goes for pilgrimage, and that we do religious celebration. If our children, our daughter-in-law, or even our wife reach 7-month pregnancy, and then we celebrate it, called mitoni, by reciting Quran, by reciting Surah Yasin and something like that. And of course, this is considered as a bid'ah by the Salafi and Wahhabis. They condemn this practice as not being Islamic. So, but for us, this is very important, making the practice of Islam is more friendly, cultural friendly, social and cultural friendly in the country. So the practice, this is what I call as the practice of wasatiyah Islam or ummatan wasatan. I always call Indonesian Islam as smiling face of Islam. So it is very difficult for you to find, what is it? Islam with angry face, but flexible, smiling. There is a lot of celebration. There is a lot of cultural accommodation. So this is the second. And the third factor, Nadim, I think because of the existence of very big moderate Muslim organization. Of course, you know it. The largest is Nahdlatul Ulama, that was established in 1926. And then the second largest is Muhammadiyah. And many other moderate Muslim organizations that become the bastion of the expansion of the efforts that contain the efforts of the Salafi Wahhabi to spread their influence in the country. And you and Muhammadiyah, of course, one of the most important legacies of Indonesian Islam, if you will. Because why? Because NU, for instance, Nahdlatul Ulama, for instance, has something like 30,000 Islamic traditional boarding school across the country called pesantren, madrasah. And if we talk about madrasah, Indonesian madrasah is different from, let's say, Afghanistan or Pakistani madrasah. Because why? Because the curriculum of madrasah and also pesantren, Islamic traditional boarding school, under the supervision of Ministry of Religious Affairs and Ministry of National Education. So that's why the madrasah and also pesantren are not a hotbed of radicalism. Now, but of course, this is if I said that, if I argue that there is no Islamophobia, but of course, Indonesia, there is some kind of division among Indonesian Muslim. As far as politics is concerned, there is a phrase that minna and minhum. Time is up?
No.
Minna and minhum. Minna meaning the rulers, the president, like the president, for instance, President Joko Widodo, now the second, in his second term, by some Muslim is not considered as from us, minna, but from them, minhum. Why? Because President Jokowi has been accused of being an anti-Islam, while of course he is I think a devoted Muslim, and also pro-China. The pro-China mainland government, Chinese, pro-Chinese. Of course, in Indonesia we have also people of Chinese origin. So Jokowi has been accused of being pro-China. So that's why if you talk about Uyghur, for instance, the Uyghur Muslims, Indonesian government seems to be not very critical to Chinese government in Beijing. I think this is because of two basic principles of Indonesian foreign policy. The first one is that non-interference policy, that Indonesian government from, let's say, in post-independent Indonesia, on August 17, 1945, adopted the principle of non-interference. Not only in the case of Uyghur, but also in the case of Muslim in other minority Muslim in the Philippines and also in southern Thailand. Even though Indonesia has been very involved in trying to make peace in southern Thailand and also southern Philippines and also in Myanmar, of course. The second principle, the second basic principle of Indonesian foreign policy is not giving any sign of supporting separatist movement. So Uyghur is considered by Indonesian government as a separatist movement. Attempting to achieve independence from China. But of course, there is a lot of solidarity among Indonesian Muslim in general, outside of government, including by Muslim organization. They visited Xinjiang on the invitation by the China government, and then they have been accused of being bought by the Chinese government. Of course, they rejected the accusation because NU and Muhammadiyah said that we want to see what happened actually in the so-called re-education camp, for instance, whether Muslims are allowed to pray, for instance, 5 times a day. So we need to check this. So this is the case. This is the situation as far as the Indonesian attitude to Uyghur case is concerned. Now, let me, so again, the problem on the Minna and Minhum related to the rise of the so-called Islamic identity politics in the last, I think, 4 or 5 years, after the election of local election in Jakarta, where one Chinese candidate actually had been accused of denigrating Quran, certain verses of the Quran, and then he fell, and then Muslim identity politics gained momentum. But after the election, actually, they said that if Donald Trump could win the election in the US because of based on identity politics, why not us? Yeah. But the problem is in Indonesia, Islamic politics is different. Yeah. Of course, as I said earlier, majority of Indonesia's population is Muslim, but they do not support Islamic political parties. In the last election, Islamic political parties, there are 3 Islamic political party, Islamic-based political party, but they failed to win the election, to gain, significant votes. They managed only to gain 14% of total votes. Why? I think identity politics has never been popular in Indonesia since the independence. So that's why identity politics, Islamic political identity politics also fell in the country. Now I would like to stop relating to Islamophobia. I would suggest there are something that Muslim in particular that should do. Yeah. We already heard suggestion by Professor Esposito and also Karen and also Asifa. I would suggest some recommendation for Muslim. I think the first one, I think it is mandatory for Muslim to put their house in order. Up until now, still many Muslim blame others for their failure in putting their house in order. They blame all other because of their failure. This is the first thing that need to be done. The second one, Muslims, particularly migrants in Europe or in the US or somewhere else or in Australia, in Western countries, should be more sensitive to local culture. Particularly on the issue like Sharia, for instance. I think the Westerners do not understand what Sharia means. Because why? Because the meaning of Sharia is much larger, much wider than the meaning of law in Western sense. Muslims should practice whether the state, whether with or without state, interference of the state, good Muslim should practice Sharia. Yeah. Because, for instance, if Muslim wants to pray, and then they should adopt Sharia or Islamic jurisprudence for this matter, for this that is fiqh. Fiqh, of course, the elaboration of Sharia. For Westerners, Sharia means amputation of hand, stoning to death. So that's the problem. Well, of course, if Muslim wants to even to sleep, yeah, if you want to go, let's say, if Muslim wants to go to toilet, for instance, and then which leg should be first? Yeah? Your right leg or left leg? Huh? Well, if you come to toilet, for instance, left, and if you go out from toilet, right? Yeah. If you sleep, to which direction? You have to put your body, for instance. So this is actually Sharia, but not many people understand this context. So I think should be more sensitive. I think one of the example insensitivity in the part of Muslim, I watched this on Australian TV. One imam originating from from Afghanistan, he said on Australian TV, ABC, if I'm not mistaken, he said that we Australian Muslim are not going to obey Australian law. We are going to obey only Sharia. This, of course, create a lot of resentment among Australians. So this is what I mean by sensitivity. Yeah? The last one, we should also develop and empower a middle-fast Islam. Moderation, justly balanced Islam in order for us to gain acceptance among people around us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you to each of the panelists. I want to pose sort of one question to each of the panelists, ask them to respond, and then we will turn the floor over to the audience for your questions and comments. So first question to Karen Armstrong, as sort of the resident historian on this panel. Your talk gave us sort of a historical overview. You talked about the origins of this sort of problem of Islamophobia going back to the Crusades. You talked about the rise of the nation state. You talked about the founding of countries such as the United States and Israel and the problem they had with their own indigenous populations. That raises the question of why are we seeing a significant upsurge of Islamophobia at this particular moment in time? It's not always consistent. It obviously has its ebbs and its flows. So the big question is, why now?
It has its ebbs and flows, I suppose, though I would say it doesn't ebb and flow as much as you might imagine. This was there in the time of the French Revolution, for example. It rumbles on. Mm-hmm. But I think what we're seeing now, she says cheerily, is the decline of the West. I think we've had our colonial period, which changed the world and in really rather drastic ways. We've had Britain then falls out after World War II. The United States takes over, and I think we're seeing the decline of the West.
So how is decline related to Islamophobia?
Because people like to find scapegoats. They like to find people who are challenging them in some way. There's a strong sense of our identity must remain intact, and we've got to fight on to keep it and preserve it, which means that all kinds of barriers and shibboleths come down. The election of Trump, for example, and I would also say the election of Boris Johnson are signs of acute decline. And the fact that we're withdrawing from the world at a time when we're becoming, in fact, more globally interconnected than ever before is another sign of decline. Other powers are coming up. And at least in Britain, we weren't, and in Europe, we knew what it was to be underdogs. All those years after the Roman Empire fell, we were nothing. People say, didn't the Muslims want to come and conquer Europe? And frankly, the Europeans said, no, there's nothing there. There's nothing for us. Let's go to the east. And so we knew that we were newcomers onto the scene. The United States, rather like Islam, achieved almost instant success. And that has been, and this is going to be very difficult for them to take, I think. After 9/11, I was often talking to people about all these matters. And when I would say this in the room, I get a sense of a shiver going around the room. But I think this kind of assertion of a uniquely Western identity, distress about other peoples, after all, that poem that you all learn about "Bring me your poor," and that's all gone out of the basket. So I think this is a sense, as they see China, India, other economies coming to the fore, there is a sense of we must look to American values and a sense of Americanism being imperiled in some way.
Question for Professor Asifa Qureshi-Landis. As a constitutional lawyer, could you try and help us understand this horrific and depressing Supreme Court ruling that upheld Donald Trump's travel ban? And what's so shocking about it, and you mentioned it, that the arguments that the court seemed to be sympathetic to were national security arguments. But the evidence, to anyone who knows anything about the topic, suggested that those people responsible for killing Americans and thus threatening American national security didn't come from the countries that were on the ban.
Yep.
Saudi Arabia, 9/11, 15 out of the 19 hijackers was not on the ban. So is there no one on the Supreme Court that knows anything about the basic facts of questions of terrorism? Is everyone there sort of, intellectually retarded, that they simply are convinced by the propaganda of the Trump administration? I mean, how do we explain this ruling? It just defies logic, it defies reason. And then the related point that you mentioned about this Sharia legislation, I mean, I don't know how many people in this audience know this, but the percentage of Muslims that in the United States is 1%. Assuming that every single one of them had a radical interpretation of Sharia, how are they going to impose that and fool the other 99%? So something really, I think, toxic is going on in American political culture that explains these developments, and I was wondering if you could try and help us decipher them.
Thank you. Well, every year I disappoint my constitutional law students when they read many, many, many cases from the Supreme Court that defy logic, right? So it's not the first time. I can explain it with the legal doctrine if you're curious. In a nutshell, the argument isn't that they were convinced of the national security argument per se. The constitutional standard is there a rational possible explanation? Is there any possible rational explanation which would justify this? And if there is, they defer on a regular basis on national security questions to the executive power. It happens all the time. It's happened in the detention cases of Muslims being detained. Korematsu, there's many cases where the kinds of actions that the executive power insists it needs to do for the sake of national security, unless you can document actual malice and motive, the court will defer and say, well, it's possible that it was this other reasonable purpose. And they tend to say, we don't know the classified information. We're not seeing the CIA documentation. We're not seeing all this information. We can't possibly second guess the government. Who are we as the court? We're a bunch of lawyers and judges. We didn't get trained in the kind of intense government decisions that have to be made, so we don't want to second guess. And there's some justices on the Supreme Court who are extreme on this. Clarence Thomas, for example, is extreme on, I don't even need to have them make a prima facie case. If they claim that they have a reason, that's enough for me. Others, there's sort of a spectrum, but others demand, okay, give us something, and then if it looks reasonable, okay, then I'm going to defer to your judgment. And then there are those who say, no, I actually think this was motivated by malice. Look at all the tweets, look at all this other thing. And actually, all of the early years of the Trump administration, there was some interesting litigation trying to figure out if a tweet was an official statement of the White House. Right? I mean, he was saying all kinds of things that were horrible. Can we take that as evidence of his malice and that kind of thing? And ultimately, the kind of logical analysis that you're talking about, like none of the countries are in any way related to any documented terrorist attack on the United States, those opinions came out in the dissenting opinions. So you had very strong dissenting opinions saying, basically what Karen Armstrong was saying in 1970, whatever, when the Salman Rushdie thing happened, we can't let this happen again. Then there were justices on the court saying, this is like Korematsu. We're going to do this all over again. Let's do this all over again. But they were in the minority, and this goes to the politics of the court and everything else. But the argument of national security does override not override. It is taken as a legitimate justification for things that otherwise wouldn't be constitutional if they weren't being given that argument. And the anti-Sharia legislation, the same thing. I mean, the kinds of the logic of whether this in fact is a threat is not an issue. It's, does the state want to pass this law? Is it reasonable under the standards by which states can pass their own laws? And unless it's targeted to a religious group, which the first Sharia ban was, specifically said Sharia, then it hits a First Amendment challenge of you're targeting a particular religion, you can't do that. But if it's written in a more neutral way, there's a lot of deference to the states to do that. So the logic is a challenge, and that's why I said we just need to keep focusing on the kinds of social pressures that can get people to realize this is not really a threat. You don't need to pass these laws in the first place. There's two things you can do when there's bad law, right? You can try to get them not to pass the law, and then once it is the law, you try to get them to strike it down as unconstitutional. If we can stop it happening at this level, you don't need to deal with a constitutional question.
Okay, thank you. A question to Professor Azra. I don't know if people know that Professor Azra is one of the most distinguished, respected, and influential Indonesian scholars and intellectuals. And so I want to ask him and push him a little bit about Indonesia's response, or what I want to argue is lack of effective response to what is clearly the worst human rights crisis on our planet today. I'm talking about the situation in China facing the Uyghurs. Now, Professor Azra, you rightly noted that Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. It's the third largest democracy. It has a middle class. It has an independent foreign policy. It's not dependent on great powers for its national security. It has a strong civil society. A Muslim country that has those characteristics, I would expect a lot more from that country when you have 1 million fellow Muslims put in concentration camps. In order to eat food, they have to sing the praises of the Chinese communist leader, denounce their own religion. Over the last several years, 200 mosques have been demolished. And there is no separatism. When you hear that Indonesia is concerned about separatism, that effectively is a Communist Party propaganda talking point. And when it comes to the principle of non-interference, Indonesia is very outspoken about the Israel-Palestine conflict and interfering in what Israel would claim it's in internal affairs. But when it comes to China, we don't want to interfere. And then the other point, and this is not a criticism just of Indonesia, it's the criticism of every single member of the Organization of Islamic Conference. Less than a year ago, the Organization of Islamic Congress, the Organization of Islamic Conference passed a resolution at its meeting in Abu Dhabi that referenced the situation of the Uyghurs in China. And the resolution said the following: the Organization of Islamic Conference welcomes the outcome of the visit conducted by the General Secretariat's delegation upon invitation from China, and commends the efforts of China in providing care to its Muslim citizens, and looks forward to further cooperation. At the precise moment you have the worst form of persecution, not just of Muslims, but in the world, Indonesia signed on to that resolution, and so did every other Muslim country. And so this gives you, now I have no expectations of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's an authoritarian regime, people don't have freedom there. I have no expectations of Saudi Arabia or of Egypt. I have a lot of expectations of people who have freedom of speech, who elect their government, who have a voice. And I would argue that when Indonesian civil society groups go on these Chinese government-sponsored propaganda trips and say, we went and we saw these so-called camps and they're wonderful, Muslims can pray, and they come back and they repeat it. And it was only recently when they were exposed did these civil society groups change their tune. So all things considered, I think there's a lot more that Indonesia could be doing, Indonesia should be doing, to defend the rights of persecuted Muslims around the world. How would you respond?
This is a very difficult question to answer, frankly speaking. Yeah, I wrote a piece op-ed in the front page of Kompas Daily the largest newspaper in Indonesia, criticizing President Joko Widodo, saying that he has no solid vision of how Indonesia should play the role in international affairs, because Indonesia is not a small country. Indonesia is a big country. Indonesia should also, has a responsibility to address various kinds of issues, including, of course, human rights abuses everywhere. But sorry to say that President Jokowi, when I met him, he said that I read already your criticism. So what? And then that's it. In his first term for 5 years, he never attended the General Assembly of UN in New York. The one who always attended every year, annually, was his vice president, Yusuf Kala. So it is very sad. I think that also will be the case in the next 5 years. So I think the situation was quite good during President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono before Joko Widodo, because I think he has a certain ambition that Indonesia should play a greater role. Indonesia should punch its weight in international plane, but not Joko Widodo. Joko Widodo is only interested in infrastructure development. That's it. No socio-cultural infrastructure, only physical infrastructure. He, constructed road everywhere, bridges or something like that everywhere in the country. Of course, this is good, but at the same time, Indonesia should play, should perform, should its responsibility in the world, in international affairs. So this is very sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
The situation.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes left, roughly. I'd like to see a show of hands. I will pick 3 people, ask your questions, and then if we have enough time, we can go for another round. So 1, 2, is there a woman that has her hand up just in the name of gender equality, since we're all Muslims and we believe in Islamic ethics? Where? At the back? Okay, over there, 3. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, go ahead. And there is a microphone right in front of you. I believe if you press the right button in front of you, there should be 2 buttons.
This one?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Got it. No, we only have one time. One question. Did people hear the question? Did people hear the question? I guess they did, unless Someone raises their hand. Okay, Karen Armstrong. I think that was really. Okay, let's take. Yeah, we'll take the two questions and then we'll have them all answered. The second person was here at the front. Make sure your microphone is on, and give us your question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the nice lecture about the Islamophobia that's happening on a global arena. I'm from India. We have discussed regarding the Uyghurs facing oppression in China. At present, the Indian government, under the present regime, the Modi government, have passed a new Citizenship Amendment Act which provides citizenship for all communities except Muslims. This is a targeted form of law to exclude Muslims in conjunction with the National Register of Citizens. So a big number of about more than 5 million, more than 5 million Muslims will be de-citizenized from India. So this is going to create one of the worst crises in the world. So in this situation, today or yesterday, one of the chief minister of one of the largest states in India have mentioned for the people who are protesting against this Citizenship Amendment Act that the opposition parties are providing them protection or providing them, soaps or food, biryani, and we, as the government, we will provide them with the bullets. So when a government, the ruler of a state in the largest state of India pronounced that in an election rally, you know how much is the hate that's been spread about this particular community who is protesting the national capital.
Okay, so what's the question?
My first question, how we can address this kind of Islamophobia that's been spread for political gains by the governments, by the agencies that's ruling one of the largest democracies of the world.
Thank you. And the last question is to you. Please have your microphone on.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Good evening.
Keep talking.
All right. Good evening. I'm a student from Georgetown University here in Qatar, and my question is to Dr. Asifa. So we talked about the Sharia law not being implemented in the U.S. system, right? If we go back to 1850s to the Mormonic expansion in the U.S. Government and how the U.S. government was reluctant with this expansion, can we justly infer that it's not about Islamophobia, it's the overall secularization of the American government that will not allow them to perform their military expansionist ideas throughout the world? Is that clear?
Can I ask for clarification?
Yeah, did you understand the question?
Yeah, so I'm just questioning, what is the connection in your mind between secularization and military expansion?
No, I mean just, religion would kind of, give it a say in the military actions that United States is promoting throughout the world, and any kind of even the government laws and prohibitions in their own country. Can we say that the government doesn't want the Sharia, but it doesn't want any kind of religious affiliation with the government?
Around the world, you mean?
No, maybe in the United States as well.
Okay. To process
Okay,
that for a second.
we know we can begin with your question on comparative right-wing nationalist movements in Europe, Karen.
These nationalist movements, I think, are fired, as I said, by the fact that we're going down in the world, and we saw that, for example, in Germany, when Germany was deeply in trouble before World War II, and you have the rise of a Nazi. A very exclusive form of nationalism. And I think that the fact that the Brexit, for example, is a symbol of this desire to be a nation state on its own and not join up. The more global we seem to be becoming, the more people are retreating into national and perhaps religious ghettos as an assertion of identity. We're more interconnected than ever before. We're interconnected electronically now on the World Wide Web, all on our own phones. Our economies are deeply intertwined. When stocks go down in one part of the world, markets plummet all around the globe that day. And we're all facing now the same environmental catastrophe. And yet, in the face of these huge, we're not used to dealing globally. We're not used to thinking in these terms. And for many people, this is a sense of a loss of identity. And it takes different forms. In France and Britain, I think, especially France, the whole attitude to Muslims is because it's religious. France is very, very secular, laïcité. To call yourself a French Muslim, a Frenchman told me, is a contradiction in terms. This is just nonsense. And Britain is just totally uninterested in religion. It's one of the worst markets for my books. And my best friends don't read my books. They say, why on earth are you bothering with this discredited stuff? So, and Holland, which is one of a very good market for my books, also has a strong anti-Islamophobic nationalist underside too. We're seeing, as I said I think earlier this evening, we're seeing a former great power, Europe, sinking, and people, and also coping with the whole idea of globalization, not knowing how to deal with that, and therefore clinging to identities that give them a sense of personhood, that as they feel their identities decline, they can define it strongly against the other. And this is very unhealthy. We can't go there because we've seen what that can lead to. And I have great fears in this respect. But it will be different in different cultures. Different people will have different histories to deal with. And it used to be the case, and it used to be the case in the United States, the Catholics were absolutely out of kilter. I was brought up Catholic myself. And one of the reasons that I come from Ireland originally, my people, and that's the reason probably why I'm writing about religion, and my fellow countrymen think I'm mad, because the Irish have a very different approach to religion. It's not British. And so people are clinging in desperate ways, and religion is one of the props, or anti-religion is one of those props. And Islam is seen as an excellent peg to bash religion because it's foreign. And it has a whole lot of what they seem like weird and wonderful and peculiar beliefs, which they can show just how stupid religion is. And so that fuels this kind of sense of righteousness. Let's get away from religion. And then we can perhaps recover our identity. We can't, because unless now we learn to treat all human beings, whoever they are, whether we like them or not, as we would wish to be treated ourselves. That's the golden rule that underlies all the religious traditions. The world is simply not going to be a viable place. And I think if the religious faiths could, instead of fussing about, as the Catholic Church does about Catholic priestly celibacy, which has caused so many problems, and birth control, which puts so many families into disrepute, and if they could concentrate on the golden rule, on compassion, on that sense of we have formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. That should be the the hallmark of our thinking today. And I think if the religious leaders could stress this element more, instead of fiddling around with kosher laws or something, then I think we might have a chance to right this balance.
Thank you. Okay, Asifa, do you want to answer the question about the United States, and then we'll try and end with the question about
I
India?
actually have a few things to say about the India question.
Okay, go ahead
I mean, I have family in India. My father's originally from Jaipur, moved to Pakistan during partition, but he still left a lot of family behind in both places. And so the Modi stuff is very personally painful. And I wanted to say something that I think may answer some of the other comment about the OIC and others, and that is that America has not just worked out the Islamophobia within the United States. I think that they have taught other countries how to weaponize discrimination of those who might be a political opponent. And the easy way to do that is to brand them as potential terrorist threats. And so if you can call a group a potential terrorist threat, that justifies all kinds of additional laws, anti-citizenship laws, surveillance, trumped up prosecution that keeps them in litigation forever. All kinds of things can ostensibly be justified. Well, we're just trying to keep our country safe. They're a potential threat. And so you have these designations of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, like these things that happen of groups that could actually be a potential political threat or other kind of, they'd have to justify their government behavior to groups that don't like their behavior. An easy way to stop that criticism is just to, they're a terrorist group. They're trying to take over. And then it allows you to do all these kinds of things. So unfortunately, I think that may explain a lot of the kind of tentative, opposition to other countries doing things in Muslim groups, because then it would make those governments themselves vulnerable to what are you doing to the groups you want to stop? And so then they hold back from saying anything because they want to be able to have that weapon themselves. And so I think that's a huge danger. And I think the other thing explains India is just all of the nationalism that's everywhere, right? And so it's just infecting everywhere, this idea that we just got to circle the wagons against people who look and talk like us, as if that's the solution to the future where we're more globalized than ever before. I think I understand your question, and I'm going to try to answer what I think your question is. You can let me know if I got it right or not. But I want to clarify that the anti-Sharia legislation is not about the U.S. government aligning itself with any religion. It is true that the U.S. Constitution is secular in a very American Anglo-secular way, not a French laïcité kind of secular way, but it's secular in the sense that we don't want our government or our state governments to affiliate with any religion. So anything that looks like the government is establishing, and the phrase in the Constitution is non-establishment of a religion, then that is unconstitutional. So the anti-Sharia legislation isn't about that. The anti-Sharia legislation is about the other part of, I would argue, the First Amendment on religion, and that is the free exercise clause. So our First Amendment has two things. The government can't attach itself to any religion, but it also can't keep people from practicing their religion. And in that way, it's very different from French laïcité. So I have a free exercise right. For example, I, as a professor at a state university, every year get a note from my dean reminding me that if I have any Jewish students, that I need to accommodate a Saturday assigned exam, because that is their right as American citizens, that I have to accommodate their religious practices. So that's a constitutional right that Muslims and every religion has. The anti-Sharia legislation arguably interferes with that, because what's happening is it's directed at judges who are handling actual cases of family law litigation where the woman is basically asking to accommodate her religiously organized contractual agreement with her husband. And that's a particularly religiously motivated thing, but it's also just an accommodation of her desire to have this particular piece of her contract that is religiously identified honored. Just like I would like to have my religious attire honored when I get my driver's license picture taken, right? These are particular things that the U.S. government has accommodated and constitutionally has been challenged, that you have to accommodate these things. And that's the scary part, is that this is not about keeping the U.S. government secular. This is about infringing on the constitutional rights of free exercise of the Muslim population. And there's lots of other cases of other minority religions also experiencing kind of unfair treatment on their religious exercise. Protestant Christians do quite well with religious freedom exercise cases, and other minority religions not always so well. So you need to show the discrepancy, and when a Jewish plaintiff comes in versus a Protestant Christian plaintiff, their religious exercise isn't always treated the same, and now we're feeling that too. All right, I hope that answers.
Okay, unless the panel wants to answer or weigh in, let me just add one last comment on the India question. How do you respond to what's going on in India and these calls for violence that are coming out of the government of India? Well, I think one thing that you have to do is it has to be condemned globally within India. I was very happy to hear Bollywood stars are condemning it. But one thing that should not be done in response to the horrific situation in India, you should not invite the Prime Minister of India to your country and give him honor and recognition, or in this case that I'm about to cite, give him your country's highest civilian honor. One of the countries in this part of the world, right after the Kashmir crackdown, and in the midst of this policy of anti-Muslim legislation and statements, invited Narendra Modi and gave him the highest civilian honor, had a big celebration, and honored him. Does anyone know what country I'm referring to? The United Arab Emirates. That encourages this type of behavior. So this is part of the problem when other countries not only stay silent, but when they honor people who are engaged in this type of, violent language, it makes the problem much worse.
We haven't heard from you, Nader. Your political expertise. Okay, I'm just curious about studying the field. Why do you think they do that?
It's very simple. This is the problem of the politics of authoritarianism. There's no internal pressure to hold elected leaders accountable. They're interested in their own national security sort of worldview and getting support from countries that can sustain them. India is a growing economy. The United Arab Emirates, in this case, wants Indian investment. They don't care about human rights. Also, I think many of these authoritarian regimes in the Muslim world that have been either silent on China and the Uyghurs or openly supportive, what they like about China is the model of state-society relations that China is implementing, the surveillance state. Anyone who opposes it will brand them a terrorist, and that's the type of societies and political systems they want to create back home. And so I think that's why these things are happening. They're not going to criticize it, and of course they all want. I'm no friend of authoritarian and irresponsible politicians, but just the other day at the Davos summit, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, when he was asked again about the Uyghurs, when he was first asked about it about a year ago, he says, "I don't know what's going on. Don't ask me, I don't know." But then when he was asked again at the Davos summit, he openly confessed the truth about Pakistan's pro-China policy. And Imran Khan said, "We don't care about human rights. We don't care about Muslim solidarity. We want Chinese money. Our economy is in bad shape." End of story. That's where we are.
And shortly before this visit, the UAE had opened a new Ministry of Tolerance, to which I was there. I was invited to be there presiding over this. And was doing something quite big with the Charter for Compassion with them there, which now, of course, after this business, we cannot continue with.
Yeah, I mean, because it's a perfect exercise in hypocrisy.
Yes.
Talk about tolerance, talk about openness, but then invite Narendra Modi to your country and give him the highest civilian honor when he's engaging in these types of atrocities. Unfortunately, that's where we are. What's
That's how we're ending. That's so depressing.
It's depressing. But let's end on a positive note. Thank you to Imad Shaheen and his leadership at this school for providing this forum. To having, how many places in the Muslim world can we gather and have these types of conversations? We can have them in the United States. We don't know for how long if Donald Trump gets elected, but we can still have them. But here in the heart of the Muslim world, at this university, we can invite these distinguished scholars and talk about the issues that concern us all. So thank you very much, Imad.